Welcome to the Open to Hope Show. I'm your host, Dr. Gloria Horsley. This show is brought to you by the Compassionate Friends and the Open to Hope Foundation. And I've got my great co-host on today, daughter Heidi Horsley. So Heidi, we have got a really good show today because we've got somebody who's written a wonderful book on about living well despite adversity. And we know a lot of people that are watching this show today have had a tremendous amount of diversity. So this is going to be a great show. You want to introduce our guest, Heidi?
Absolutely. And like you said, Mom, everyone watching has had adversity today. And we are going to talk about how do you live well despite having the adversities that we've all had. Our guest today is Harriet Cabelly. And Harriet is a social worker and positive psychology coach. She counsels clients as they cope and grow beyond their grief and painful circumstances. She is one of the coaching experts on WOR Radio, Change Your Attitude, Change Your Life, and has appeared on ABC and Fox News as a parenting coach. She is the author of Living Well Despite Adversity, Inspiration for Finding Renewed Meaning and Joy in Your Life. Welcome to the show, Harriet.
Hi, thanks. Thanks for having me on.
How did you get interested in people transcending loss?
So that's a great question because I have a history with that question. It didn't just start with my daughter having her own personal challenges. It goes way back since I was a teenager. So I'm not really sure where that spark came from, but it was really in me since I was 17, 18 years old. And then I picked up this amazing book that I think is a must read for every human called Man's Search for Meaning. Ended up writing a paper about it in college and then in graduate school. And I majored in psychology, and I was just always interested in just the idea of how some people can have bad things happen to them and come out seemingly put together and almost even, shall I dare say, thriving, smiling and carrying on in a positive way, while other people who somehow had far less go wrong could be walking around kind of with a bag over their head and feeling bitter, jealous, and in Jewish there's a word for bisina, kind of just grouchy. And not to judge, but that line of you're either bitter or better. You know, you change that one letter, E or I. Do you become better through it? Do you become bitter? How do you get through it and then grow through it? So that's a theme of my life, and that's really what I call it, a theme of my life. And I've always been a bookie. I read tons of books, and I love memoirs, again, how people go on and transcend. And then I had my own challenge. I call it.
Kind of a surprise when you have your own challenge, isn't it?
Right. My middle daughter was born with disabilities, neurological deficits, and I went through my grief and I ranted and raved in my therapist's office. Why me? And all the unanswerable questions that we know are ridiculous to ask because it's a waste of energy, but some of us go down that path. I was one of them. The big why question, I call it. And obviously there's no answer to it. So I with the help of a great psychologist, he helped me shift from the why, I like to say from the why questions to the how, because the how and the what's are really the answerable ones that we could work with. How do we then move forward? How do we cope? What do we do with what we've been given? And those you could work with. The whys are just an exercise in futility, shall I say. So, okay, so fast forward. So my daughter was born with disabilities. I went back to grad school. I got a degree in social work. I said, I want to work with parents going through this kind of thing because I was helped so amazingly by a psychologist and a wonderful support group.
So you went on to try to find meaning in the loss yourself.
Absolutely. And I held on to that Man's Search for Meaning book, and I read it religiously once a year or once every other year, and I still do to this day. In fact, I leave book clubs.
I just want to say something about that book because I know everybody out there hasn't read it. It also was life-changing for me after my brother died. I was only 20 and it absolutely changed my life. What I want to say quickly to people is Man's Search for Meaning is written by Viktor Frankl, and it's a story about how he survived the Holocaust despite watching his entire family and many of his friends perish. So it is his story about how he not only survived but thrived, and basically how we need to find our why for why we are on this earth, our purpose and our meaning. And if we do that, the everyday how is not going to be as difficult. And it sounds like that is definitely what you have done, Harriet, despite your own adversity.
Right. So and it was very conscious. And I am telling you, that book really was a guidepost. Okay.
Right.
So now fast forward. She's 19 years old, the same daughter. Her name is Nava. So she goes through a medical crisis, having nothing to do with her disabilities. She had ulcerative colitis, and just without getting into the whole story, she ended up being hospitalized for a year. She was on a respirator for 4 months. She miraculously survived. She went into rehab for 9 months. She miraculously recovered completely.
Wow.
So I thought, as a mother, I got a second lease on life. What do I do with this? And I took a year off from my job. At that time, I was a school social worker. And I returned back to school after she came home after the year-long hospitalization. But it didn't feel right. I just said, what do I do to honor this miracle? You know how when unfortunately people lose family members and they go through negative outcomes, and people start organizations, they find their meaning, they write books, they start foundations. And again, some people don't do those big things, but they transform in inner ways that possibly are more subtle, but still very powerful. And I said, well, I had a good outcome. I had a positive outcome. I feel I need to do something with that. And what do I do? So it was all churning in me, and I had a lot of angst, and I'd sit in my Board of Ed job. No offense to anyone. I found it boring at that point. And I said, I don't know what to do with myself. So I started taking on all these little, I call them little things. I went on a Patch Adams clowning trip. Patch Adams is a doctor who clowns all over the world and has an amazing view on holistic medicine. We puppy raised a dog to then work with someone with disabilities. So we were puppy raisers for a year and a half, and he actually passed all his tests and went on to work with a little boy in Pennsylvania who has cerebral palsy. So I was really, talk about meaning, I was really looking for meaningful things to do with my miracle and how to honor it. I attempted a book. The book, I had a collaborative writer, I had an agent, and it got about 39 rejections. And even though we know Chicken Soup books got about 80, and many books go through many rejections, at that point my agent said, I think you can put the book down, and because it's a universal and an evergreen theme, maybe you can come back to it sometime in the future. But what I was attempting to do was a memoir of my daughter's year in the hospital. So I put it down, and I said, now what? And I was working in the schools. I said, you know what, I'm going to start a blog. And in my blog, it didn't come to me right away, but after a couple months, I said, I know what I want to do. I love stories. I love inspiration. I love books. I want to interview people. I want to interview someone maybe once a month. Let me give it a shot and find people who've had their problems and how have they overcome them? How have they transcended them?
So Harriet, I know that you've interviewed a lot of people, and with all these interviews, have you found themes and patterns that have helped people to live well despite adversities?
Absolutely. Many, many themes and patterns. And so what I did was I compiled my 36 interviews, and at the end of each interview, I gleaned out some of the themes and just wrote a short little paragraph or two based on my own either personal experience or professional expertise. So each chapter may have one or two that I extrapolate from. So what are a couple of the themes? So we talk about purpose. So let's get to purpose. You have to have a purpose after going through any adversity. You have to somehow find a meaning and a reason to wake up and go on, whether it's due to an accident that caused you to become paralyzed, that I have a couple in here, whether it's unfortunately because someone lost a child, someone lost a parent young, someone is overcoming drug addiction, whatever it is. And there's 36 interviews and probably 30 different challenges. So I really looked for, as I like to say, a diversity of adversities to show that there are themes and there are general ways. Of course, everyone deals differently, but there are specific and general ways that people hook on to life to help them pull through. And one of them is perfect. We need to figure out a renewed purpose after going through something difficult for two reasons. A, it helps us cope, and B, it helps us grow on.
Well, and I think you and I and my mother, all of us found purpose in a similar way because, you know, my brother died and my mother's son died, and you've had all your adversity with your daughter's health problems, etc. And all of us decided that we wanted to help other people that had gone through adversity to find hope and to heal, because we had been helped along the way.
Absolutely.
So that is definitely the way I found meaning again. Because I think when you're working with people that have had a death, one of the things that they say is, but Heidi, I don't have any meaning. How am I going to find meaning? My child, my sibling, my spouse, they're gone.
Right, right. And that's the journey. And that's the journey. First, you have to go through the grief work. And that is another big theme in the book, is you have to allow yourself that journey. You got to go into the darkness to be able to come out, to find and not just find it, but to be able to hold on to that light. But you first have to allow yourself to go deep in. And a lot of us, and in our pill popping society, I don't have to tell you, a lot of times we're not allowing ourselves that. We're not giving ourselves that permission. We're numbing and doing all kinds of things because the pain feels so bad. But in the end, it keeps us more stuck. So we need to grieve the work to come through it, and then start to slowly pick up the pieces and find a renewal, find a way to integrate the loss, whether it's death or body parts or any type of challenge. One man I interviewed is blind, and the amazing work that he does, and people with CP and they have speech impediments, and yet they become motivational speakers. And one of the amazing themes that comes out is that the human spirit is limitless.
You particularly tell one story in your book about someone who was killed by a terrorist.
Yes.
In Israel.
Yeah.
How did his mother and dad and family deal with that?
Well, he was the oldest of 4, and he was 13 when he was killed by a terrorist in Israel. And what did they do? They went on, after grieving horrifically, and she wrote a book, and they went on speaking all over, talking about helping people. Once again, the help of being a helper, helping others. And now, well, not now, in the last 10 years, they started an amazing organization in Israel for family members who've been a victim of terrorist attacks. So whether it's kids, parents, grandkids, friends, and they run programs, and they run summer camps, and they bring in people from all over the world to do clowning, to do dance programs, drama programs, all kinds of things. It's called the Kobe Mandel Foundation, and it's huge. I mean, I think Judy Gold is a comedian here in Manhattan, and I recently heard her speak, and she said how she was just in Israel, being a comedian for one of their programs.
Wow. So you really interviewed some high profile people, but I'm thinking back to something you said earlier, that it can be small things too.
Absolutely. So it can't be that every single person starts this major organization or writes the book or does something big. We can transform in smaller ways. I mean, if I look at myself in terms of, so what do I have to show for it? I mean, obviously my book at this point is so meaningful to me because it's the outgrowth of my theme of life and my daughter's miracle. I kind of combined the two because, like I said, even before I had my daughter, I was always interested in that theme. So for me, whoa, this all came together. And so this is my baby. But it doesn't have to be something so concrete or something so obvious. It could be internal shifts. We could live differently. I mean, I know I do. Some of my friends think I'm nuts. I mean, I live with a much stronger sense of urgency. I feel like you can never put things off because you don't know when your time is up. I mean, when I would sit by my daughter's bedside when she was hooked up to every machine in the book and I'd hear every beep and bleep, how could you not realize that our lives all hang by the thinnest thread? And thereby, by the grace of God, go I. It could be at any time, at any moment. So I feel like I live much more intentionally and better than I did before.
And I think I was reading some things where you talk about gratitude too.
Yes, and the idea that we need to be conscious of the good that we have in our life. And I like to use that visual of the donut, the hole and then the sprinkles and the chocolate, and how many of us, naturally, it's human nature, we tend to focus on what we don't have, that hole in the middle, or I wish I had, or they have, or comparing ourselves, as opposed to looking and saying, what are our sprinkles on top? And what colors are they? And what color is the icing? And can we focus on that? That's not to be Pollyanna-ish. and pretending like we don't have problems. We do, but it's the power of the and we also have the good. So
I
if
like
someone,
that. I like that, Harriet. And sometimes when we're having a really bad day, we really need to force ourselves into those places of gratitude.
right.
Sometimes you just feel like there's nothing to be grateful for. So sometimes we have to force ourselves into those places, and then you start to slowly feel better.
Right, and it starts to spread, because what do they say? What you focus on expands.
Exactly.
So that exercise of writing down 3 things you're grateful for before you go to sleep, or WWW, what's working well. I mean, when my daughter was in the hospital for a year, I actually did that. I mean, what am I going to say at that point? She's on a respirator, but I said, thank God she's in one of the best hospitals in New York, just by chance, because she was taken in as through the ER. Thank God, I remember saying, this is funny, thank God my youngest daughter, who was home with her stepfather, thank God they had a great relationship. Because what if I was sleeping at the hospital for a year and they weren't getting along? Right. So like sometimes you feel like you have to pull, but again, it's a way of helping us cope, keeping us above water, so to speak, and shifting.
I saw this movie once about finding happiness after loss, and they had somebody that was not doing well, little stickers, and put them around their house, and every time they looked at the sticker, they had to intentionally focus on something positive.
Right.
And it shifted the way that they felt.
Right.
But gratitude actually changes the brain chemistry. There's been some recent research done on that. It isn't just, this is a fun idea. Right. No, you can actually change your brain chemistry.
Absolutely. This person at University of Wisconsin, I think his name is Richardson, he's doing a ton of research on the power of gratitude. And Dr. Emmons, I mean, there are a lot about the neuroplasticity or neuroscience, just like with resilience. Resilience they're seeing is not just what we're born with. You mentioned resilience, but it's a skill set. And they're bringing in resiliency curriculum into the schools now. The whole piece of social emotional development, that these are things that can be taught. It's not just, well, you're just by nature more resilient. Yeah, there is a piece of genetic component, absolutely. But having said that, that doesn't mean we still can't bump up little pieces here and there by what we input into our lives.
Absolutely. Well, listen, show us your book. This is a beautiful book, Living Well Despite Adversity. Fantastic. And where do we get it? And do you have a website?
Yes. So it's on Amazon. If you punch in the title of the book or my name, it will come up on Amazon. And my website is rebuildlifenow.com. Rebuildlifenow.com.
That's wonderful.
Rebuild with what we've got.
Well, before we close the show, have you got a couple of tips for people who are feeling down and having a down day?
Having a down day. There's always tomorrow. There's always another day. We get another chance. And a lot of our well-being is in our control. A lot of it is based on our choice. And again, going back to my man, Viktor Frankl, it's not so much what happens to us, it's how we respond to what happens to us. And that's the piece we can work on.
Because at the end of the day, as Viktor Frankl said, the only thing we really have control over is our attitude.
Right. Right. And that's ours to work on.
Well, thank you so much for being on the show today and for being who you are, because you're a wonderful, positive light in this world.
Oh, thanks for having me. This is great.
Harriet, I love your energy. It's amazing.
Thanks
so much. And thank you for really showing everybody through who you are that despite major adversity, you are living well and you are living your best life.
I hope so. I try. That's all we can do is try.
Exactly.
We want to thank everybody for watching this show today. And Heidi and I always want to remind you that if you've lost hope, please lean on ours until you find your own. And God bless.